G'day, I'm Ben from OneCode. I'm here to present to you the More Players, Fewer Servers, which is the presentation about how to get the most out of your server infrastructure, make sure your game is playable and popular, make sure you don't get absolutely swamped on Twitter with everyone complaining about latency or desync, as people will call it, which is lag, but a fancy name for it, or any of the other wonderful things that your players will eventually say to you on Twitter when they miss a shot and try and blame lag for it. At least you'll be able to say it wasn't us. I'm Ben from OneCode. I am a network engineer and architect who has built quite a few ISPs here in Australia and a couple overseas as well. I have a background in infrastructure engineering and esports. I've run esports teams, competed in esports years ago, back in the late 2000s. So I have a very strong affinity for gaming, and then I coupled that with my enjoyment of building servers and networks to become what I am today, which is the latency nerd, as a few of my friends call me. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about what you can do and what decisions you make early could have massive ramifications for you down the track and make life hard, versus a few key decisions early on can save you a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of hair kept in your scalp. Okay, so the topic is, what the best way to get the most out of your servers, picking a location and all that. We're going to start basic though. I'm going to start here and explain to you the flow of your traffic, how it gets from your player to your server, and what are all the factors in the middle that influence that. And there's quite a few. It's going to be a bit overwhelming, and if it does get overwhelming, don't forget, at any time you can just leave a question on the video, or even if a day down the track, just hit me up on Twitter. My tweet was in the first and I'll put it at the end again so you can see my handle. Just message me. I'm not going to charge or anything. I'm just happy to answer your questions. There's no issue at all. Okay. So you've got three parts to how your traffic flows for your game. It starts at the user and it goes through the network, the internet, into the server. So we're going to start off first with the user. Okay. Which is, where are they? What is a user as a player or gamer, depending on what way you want to call it. And I'm just going to quickly cut across to a nice population density map for Asia Pacific, because most of this presentation will be Asia Pacific focused, but it does apply anywhere. But Asia Pacific is quite a unique region in many ways, which I'll explain as I go, why it's a bit harder to get game servers working in, say, Asia versus Europe or America. So as you can see, just jumping around Asia Pacific straight away, we'll start in Southeast Asia. You can already see there's like really densely populated spots and then whole islands where no one's on them. Like, you've only got to compare the heat map here to West Papua or Papua New Guinea, to the main island of Indonesia, and you can see the crazy population density just in this tiny little horn here. Then you move up again, you got the Singapore density, you got KL, Kuala Lumpur. Moving up a bit further, you've got like the Bangkok. You can see India is lit up like a Christmas tree, as is China, two most populated countries in the world. We wouldn't expect any less. One of the sleeping giants a lot of people forget about, the Philippines. Very highly populated country, massive growing middle class, so people buying computers, emerging onto the internet. A lot of these people are mobile first, but then you're still getting at computer or playing at internet cafes or PisoNet in Manila, very popular. And other Southeast Asian nations of note, we've got Thailand, especially Thai teams making massive impact on the Southeast Asian Counter-Strike scene at the moment because of, again, that rising middle class, more people playing games. And you've got Ho Chi Minh City, or Saigon as it used to be called, in bottom of Vietnam, and coming up through Asia. Got Hanoi in the north of Vietnam. Then we've got the Pearl River Delta, which encompasses Guangzhou, Dongguan, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Zhuhai, and Macau, to name a few of those cities. Massively dense, populated metropolitan area. We come across to the Shantou areas, up through Xiamen. You can see these population centers, they're dotted all over Asia. Another set here, Taipei, Taichung, and Kaohsiung. Also, again, massive populations. And we go up to the big boys league. You got Shanghai, you got Tokyo, the biggest city in the world by population density. Osaka, Nagoya, Incheon and Seoul, Busan, Daegu. All these massive cities, and not to forget, Tianjin, Beijing, even Dalian or Shenyang, and then up even into Eastern Russia. Like, Asia Pacific is a big area, and we're only dinting one side. I haven't got through it yet. We've got over here Khabarovsk, here, one of the eastern capital of Russia. A lot of Counter-Strike players, again, as just an example, as I come from a Counter-Strike background, but this applies to most games. People play lots of games. you'll be surprised how sparsely spread out your players are in the Asia Pacific. And as we come across the Pacific Ocean, and then you've got the west coast of USA. You've got, your LA metropolitan, again, one of the biggest cities in the world, San Francisco, San Jose, the whole Silicon Valley Bay Area, Sacramento, Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, San Diego, and these are all within Asia Pacific latency. This side of America, it's on the edge, but it's right there. And then wrapping back down again, you've got all the Pacific Island nations, which are again emerging middle classes, more people playing games in those nations, more people getting computers. And then you've got, wrapping back down, you've got, of course, Auckland, and then Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, the triangle, as we call it in Australia. Again, that's 70 to 80% of our population and 3 major cities, 3 big world cities, and all really sparsely apart. Like, we scroll back out and you can see how far apart all those blue dots are. Boom, 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 boom. Like, they're just everywhere. So this, it creates some problems. This presents some issues straight away. Just off the bat, you can see that and go, well, hang on, like, I can't just buy a server in Sydney and service all these people. I can't buy a server in Hong Kong and service all these people because they're separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. Okay, so I'll just flip back into the presentation now. So on that note, just to give you an idea of how big this market is, I've just sort of given you an overview of, spending. This is the Newzoo Global Markets Report that I had a skim through for 2020, and this is all Asia Pacific numbers. This isn't global. So, the spend in Asia Pacific is 75% growing year on year. You've got a growing player base of nearly 5% year on year, and that player base is pretty big. It comes in at like 1.45 billion people playing games, multiplayer games too, mind you. That's a lot of players. That it's astronomically huge. It's actually the biggest gaming region in the world. When you compare to Europe and the US, so the other regions we would talk about, you have your NA is what North America, which includes Mexico, USA, Canada, and stuff here. But then this is a bit of a gray area because it can also fall under what we call LATAM, which is the Latin America area of region. Then you've got your MENA, which is your Middle East, North Africa area, and then you got your Europe area, and most of Russia tends to fall in the Europe zone. And when you count the Asia Pacific size, especially if you do count India, because they are inside the latency tolerances to play on Asian servers, especially Singapore servers, it's the biggest gaming region in the world. It is. There is no region that's big, especially when you consider the penetration of gaming in these regions, especially in the major ones: Philippines, South Korea, China, Thailand, Malaysia. Massive gaming communities. In Indonesia too, especially Philippines, Indonesia, they have esports events every weekend at the shopping center. Like, these are very big communities, very massive popularity with games. So it's a good place to capitalize as a developer. You should target this area, but you need to make sure that you can do it well with servers. You can't just buy a couple servers and call it a day, because it is a very messy area, very messy network, and I'm going to explain why in time. Okay, so moving on from that, let's move into the network. What does the network look like in the world? Okay, so this is a fractal that I believe was built at MIT of the internet. And as you can see straight away, the internet is not one contiguous network. It's a collection of networks. And to give you an idea just how many networks that is, I've got actually there's a free tool which sort of counts by Hurricane Electric, one of the world's biggest backbones. They count how many ISPs there are and how many networks there are. So I'm just going to quickly pull that up and show you. And as you can see right now, as of recording at 24th of September, there's 73,345 ISPs on the planet. Okay, there's 74,000-ish networks active on the internet. So 74,000 different places your traffic can come from, originate from, and those networks don't all connect with each other everywhere. There's no perfect world here. There's commercial agreements, there's reasons, there's cost. Everyone's got a different budget, everyone's got a different way of operating, and that has a knock-on effect on your game, because not all your customers are going to use the same ISP. Not all your customers are going to be in the same city, country, or even locale. Like, you could have players at the top end of Northeast Asia and guys on the very far west of Asia trying to play against each other in games. Okay, so the internet is a mess, and it's a good and a bad thing. It's good because there's no one central authority. The internet is this beautiful network of anyone can do it if they really try. but at the same time, it means that there are lots of compromises and poor decisions and poor designs and all the fun stuff, as I call it. So, how does your user traffic travel? Now, I've got here's another one I prepared earlier for you all. This is what I call the submarinecablemap.com website. This shows you all of the cables that go under the ocean. These cables are how your users connect to your servers. So each of these cables, they vary in size from the size of a dinner plate in diameter to the size of your arm. The newer ones I've seen are actually skinnier than my arm. I've seen them in person and touched them. They're tiny. The newer cables are much smaller, much more high technology, but they all essentially all do the same job, which is they carry photons of light, carrying your packets for your game between A to B. These are generally not owned by a singular ISP, although some can be. They're generally owned by consortiums. So groups of ISPs group together and buy a cable together and then build it between the certain countries. And for an example, here's one of the major connectors of Asia. It's called the AAG, the America-Asia Gateway Cable. It's one of the biggest in terms of coverage. As you can see, it connects to most of your Southeast Asian cables. I'll see if I can quickly, while I'm talking to COME3, this is one of the biggest too. And as you can see, it again connects to a lot of Asian nations. So these cables are consortium cables. And then you can compare that to that one, if I got it right. Yeah, so this one here is owned by Telstra. So it's owned by one telco. They own the whole cable. So each company owns different cables. Some are consortiums, some are owned by groups. And the problem you're going to face is that you could have two users, for example, in Jakarta, both going to a server in Hong Kong, but they're on different ISPs. One ISP has a good deal on a good cable, gets you up there in 40 milliseconds. Another user has a poor deal, or worse, has a provider who doesn't have any forward capacity to Hong Kong themselves and relies on an ISP. And that ISP could do something really silly, which I have seen personally recently. Send the traffic from Jakarta to Singapore, to Perth, to Sydney, to Los Angeles, to Tokyo, to Hong Kong. So the scenic route, a well-traveled packet, all good and well for the packet, really poor experience for the player, right? Because now they're pinging the server for 400 milliseconds. Their packet is literally going around the globe and back to get to a server that it should just go from Jakarta, Singapore, to Hong Kong and call it a day. So that's how the traffic travel around. This has a big influence, and you'll start seeing the major OTTs, I'm going to call them, which are the over-the-top providers. They're cloud providers. So your Azure's, Google Cloud, Amazon, AWS, Amazon Web Services, and the likes of those guys, they're now buying these submarine cables because they're sick of fighting with the ISPs. They're sick of arguing about, but I want the best latency. And because they're big enough, they're juggernauts, they can afford it. They actually just buy these cables themselves now and build them, because that way that gets around it. But it doesn't mean your traffic is necessarily going to use that cable if you're on a cable they own. You have to remember that they may still have an agreement with the local ISP or another ISP, and the traffic still could take the scenic route. It's a very hard thing to fix, and it's a very hard thing to control from your end. So here is a nice little diagram that shows you how your traffic could flow from the server to the player. And in this example, we have a worst case, which is that it's passing through 4 different networks between the player and your server. So it may start going from your server through the cloud provider, then across to what we call a backbone provider. So it could bounce through a couple backbone providers, then to the last mile carrier, which is your ISP, which then goes to the player. This is generally a bad experience, and it's still pretty generous, because we've seen a lot of routing that can pass through up to 8 networks between a player in, say, Tokyo and a server in Tokyo. We've seen some really crazy hot potato routing, we call it, which is, the game of hot potato, where everyone is just trying to hand the traffic off as quick as they can. So they just play hot potato. They see a packet come in, they just find the nearest exit point of their network and throw it out. Because then that way it only passes through one router. They make more money because they're charging full price, but it's costing them nothing to throw it to another network and let them deal with the issue. So that sort of, routing is really not good. Which comes to a hard bitter pill to swallow for a lot of developers, which is that telco carriers and the underlying network owners, they do not care about your game. They just don't. The traffic volumes that gaming create are low. As a lot of you developers will know who write multiplayer engines, your packets are tiny. You send a lot of them, but you still send tiny packets. So your payloads are small, so your overall traffic volume is quite low. Compare that to someone like a Netflix or a YouTube or a Disney Plus. Their traffic volumes are in the gigabits or even terabits now. So they have a lot more sway with the carriers because they're responsible for so much traffic on the carriers' networks, and the penetration of their technology into the carriers' customer base is much larger. If you take an example of, say, Telstra in Australia, they're not going to have a massive contingent of gamers who are on the support line complaining about latency every 5 minutes. But if you take Netflix out for 15 minutes, I guarantee you their support lines will light up, their switchboard just light up. Everyone's like, where's my Netflix? It's broken. Like, life is ending. So as a game company, you don't have as much leverage with these telcos to fix the latency issues that you're seeing. And that's difficult to solve. It's hard to fight that because these massive juggernaut telcos, you've only got to go look at all the stock exchanges to see. You go look in those top hundreds, guarantee you'll find telcos. Telcos are generally quite profitable, very high revenue base, so that they're massive conglomerates. They own undersea cables, they own TV stations, they're quite big companies, so they don't care about your little game in the corner or even your decently sized game in the corner, as we've seen with companies like Riot building their Riot Direct network. They got sick of arguing with carriers, so they just built their own network. But not all game publishers, unless you're a AAA publisher, you can't afford to be buying fiber across massive continents and subsea capacity and data center footprints and hiring engineers to manage all that, because the more you get, the more guys you need to be watching it and managing it and controlling it and expanding it, and not to mention all of the commercial negotiations you have to have with all these companies to now, as you're a carrier, you're on the same footing as them. It's quite an unwielding experience for a little developer to go, well, okay, we'll just go and build our own backbone then. It's not going to happen. It does happen, as we've seen. Riot does it. Valve operates their own AS number. Some of the big guys do operate their own networks. They do work with ISPs, but again, these are the top guys, and most developers will never be able to do that, and that's not surprising. Telco is hard and expensive. All right, let's just press that button there. So finally, we get to the server infrastructure, which is where you pick your locations, where you put your game servers, where the players connect to. So just a quick overview of those locations right now today. The location you're going to have, you've got Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney, Seoul, and US West. That's your Asia Pacific server regions. There's a few others I've missed out, but generally I've seen, and even Seoul is quite a new addition to this, most of your Asia Pacific, not counting China, because it's totally different regulatory jurisdiction, you must use Chinese companies. You all know the jewel there. We're not going to go into that today. But generally, most of your game servers are going to be in one of these 5 to 6 locations. And if you're a slightly popular game, at the moment, you've probably got to buy servers in every location. You've got to get servers in Singapore. You've got to get servers in Hong Kong. You've got to get servers in Tokyo, Sydney. And it becomes expensive fast because now you've got idle capacity lying around because you've got to have your baseline, which is how many servers do I need just to have the game accessible for matchmaking, because you've got to factor in, even if you do have a full matchmaking queue and you've got no servers, you've got to wait for your autoscaler to kick in, or if you don't have an autoscaler, the SMS to hit the guy to press the button to turn on the extra server in Tokyo. So it's not necessarily a one size fits all solution using all these different cities at once. And as you will all know, not all providers are cut from the same cloth. So even though you might get an epic experience in Singapore, you'll be having major difficulties with your server provider in Hong Kong. It's causing you all sorts of headaches. And then your Tokyo provider, for some reason, the Japanese players don't access it properly for whatever reason because they're not the correct provider. So this all sums up into a sort of a latency challenge. It is that you've launched your game, you've bought all these servers, but the players are still complaining about lag. I'm still lagging. Everything's still annoying me a lot. It's really hard to get these servers right, and it's especially in Asia, because as the map shows, unlike a lot of other regions, you've got a lot of ocean and a lot of submarine capacity and a lot of, compare that to somewhere like Europe. All countries, all interconnected, it's easy. They just put the fiber under the ground and connect up the data centers and away they go. You come back to Asia and all of a sudden, no one's really connected. These are all ocean straits. For those of you not from, Asia Pacific, nothing's really connected. Everything requires these undersea cables. They require these ISPs, and a few major ISPs control a lot of the capacity. They charge a lot, so it causes a lot of providers to not buy from them, or to buy from them where it's cheap, which causes really suboptimal routing, which affects your server latent choice. And that's where we get into the death spiral, or as I call it, matchmaking queue death. And that is where you have servers, but they're not in the right spot. So your latency matching algorithm isn't matching people together quick enough. people are in queue for too long, so they quit the game. So then the queue time goes up and more people quit the game. And it just becomes this spiral of death because you can't get enough players online at the right time in the right region to trigger the servers to fill them. Even though you might have enough players, you might have players between Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and Singapore. You still don't have a server in between all of them that seems to be even enough latency for them all to play a game. And that's this death spiral. That's where it comes from. And it results in some really bad experiences. You've got limited locations for servers in Asia Pacific. A lot of the networks are not optimized for latency. They're optimized for cost. They're just ISPs build to the bottom dollar. They try and get the most capacity for the cheapest price to make the most revenue, to make the most profit per user. That's just it's the sum of the game. It's the way everyone plays it. There's not another way to really do it in last mile ISP land. It's really hard as it is building a last mile ISP. They're what we call CapEx heavy, so it costs a lot to set up, but the long tail is very long if you get it right. But to get it right, you can't really push too hard for that quality. You've got to really ride the line of people complaining about their internet and people not complaining, and sitting right in the middle line so you make the most money from the network. This means that as a developer, you now have growing costs for your servers and your data because you have to buy more servers in more cities. You're fracturing your player base. You're meaning that players are now, especially if your game isn't popular in a certain country, it's harder to get popularity because the few players in that country trying to play are now lagging when they play on your servers in another country. So it just starts having all these big knock-on effects when it comes to that. Queue times go up, death spiral starts, matchmaking pools get restricted, and finally your players leave because the game's too laggy, the game queue never pops, insert excuse here. And that final effect means that your revenue goes down. So you say to me, Ben, how do I fix this? How do I get rid of these issues in my life cycle of my game? Well, you tell your players to switch your ISP, but it's unlikely going to be popular. Saying to your players, oh, it's just your ISP, they're going to say, oh, they're just blaming our ISP because they don't know the issue. So it's not going to help. We've seen this as well. Devs either hide the latency or they fake it. So no one really cares if they're lagging, right? It all feels the same. My game's too casual, which is wrong. If your game is lagging, no matter how casual, people are going to notice, people aren't going to play. You can mute your Twitter notifications so you don't hear the people complaining about the lag. That's not going to help either. And finally, this is the AAA publisher playbook, which is to buy, build an ISP, and go it alone. How hard could it be? Famous last words of every project I've ever come across. So none of these options are really viable. One option is to harness your player analytics, is to spend the time to insert into your game and start collecting that data. Where are my players coming from? What ISPs they're using? What's their average latency like? There's plenty of tools out there that do this, that integrate with all the major game engines. Some of the game engines like Unity actually offer it in engine already for you. Major players like Firebase, Tableau have plugins for game engines now. Game Analytics is a company we've come across. It can be even simple as just dumping out CSV files from your game servers of every IP that connected into an Excel file. That's all you really need to get the basic idea of this. And of course, Microsoft Azure has all this stuff built in, and we believe so does the AWS and Google stuff as well. So here's an example. Okay, this isn't any real game. This is one that I just cooked up to give you an example of what your analytics could start telling you. Okay, so you've got your game, you've launched. It's been a week or two. Numbers are up, downloads are good on the stores, players are liquid. So you dump out this data from however you've collected it, and you look and you go, okay, where are the ISPs coming from? There's plenty of free APIs out there for you to send a long list of IPs to, and it'll tell you all the ISPs it comes from, okay? So it's pretty easy to geolocate that data just based on the IP of the user. It's not perfect, but you don't need perfection. This is just a broad cut to understand where most of my players existing. And in this example, we have a lot of players in Australia, a pretty decent sizable chunk in the US, a good chunk in Canada, and then we got like a shotgun smattering over Asia Pacific. So we've got some players in Malaysia and Singapore, a handful of players in the Philippines, a couple players in the Pearl River Delta area, so that would include Hong Kong, Macau, all that area again. Got a player in Guam apparently in the middle of the ocean. Got some players in China. We got some players in India. Now, if the dot was just Australia and America, great, you win. You just won the lottery. You don't have to deal with any lagging servers because you can just go and buy some AWS servers or some Google servers or whatever you want in Sydney, in Perth, some in LA, a couple in Seattle, and away you go. You'll be fine because all of those, major economies, especially America and Australia, the providers are well connected with the local ISPs. Job done. You're fine. But what about all these players here on these little island nations that are all separated by ocean? This is where life becomes difficult because you could plausibly just buy some Hong Kong servers, but the issue you're going to have is that will the Chinese players have access to Hong Kong servers? We don't know because of political tensions and, different laws around internet capacity usage in China. What about the Indian players going to Hong Kong? Because they're going to go down to Singapore and up to Hong Kong in a perfect world, but in a real world, they could go from India to Oman through Europe, across America, and across that way because it's cheaper. Or they could go India to Singapore, down into Perth, across Australia, and back up because, again, it's cheaper. So it's very hard for you just to throw some Hong Kong servers in here. What you'd actually want to do, if the world was perfect, you'd put your servers in Manila. The issue there is that A, there's not many servers in Manila for you to buy right now, and B, there's not much capacity going to the Philippines because the local carriers control most of the in and out. So it's not viable. So you're not left with, the only option you're left with here is actually to buy multiple locations. You probably buy some server capacity in Hong Kong, some server capacity in Singapore, and you probably end up buying some server capacity in India for safety. And then you have to partner with a local Chinese company and get your game legalized in China to officially service the Chinese players. At which point you've now bought 4 server regions for what looks to be on this, probably the same amount of players as you've got in America and Australia where you've bought for 1 server region each. It's not very cost effective, is it? And it means that your revenues, it means your OPEX goes up and it means you make less money on your game. You net less profits on your game now. So here's what I came up with many years ago and what I've been working to build here at OneCode. And this is, what the whole team here is now behind. We're all pushing hard on it. And that was that let's build a new server region. Let's pick that island in Guam I mentioned before. That was just a happy coincidence. That data had a Guam IP in it. I can't remember how I got there. I wasn't trying to drop a spoiler. And that is, we figured out that if we bought, and I'll just cut back across to the map again for a second. So this big spaghetti here, this big spider web, that's Guam. As you can see, quite a few cables come in and out of Guam. And more importantly, a lot of those cables are not too hard to buy capacity on. So what we did was we went and bought capacity on the cables. We then had to go and set up data center footprints in, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, Manila, Sydney, Brisbane, LA, Seattle, and a number of other cities around Asia Pacific, because we have to go and pick the traffic up from the ISPs because we can't trust them to bring it to Guam for us, right? So we've got to buy our own highways out of Guam down to those cities, and then we pick up the traffic in, say, Sydney of an Australian player, and then we haul it back to Guam. What that resulted in was that we now have a network that is under 100 milliseconds. 100 milliseconds is, I believe, in my extensive testing, 100 milliseconds, especially for first-person shooters, is your ceiling. Okay, as long as you're below 100, most players won't complain. In highly competitive scenarios, you do want it lower, but in that case, you would have local servers. But for your big, your casual player base, which is where most of your revenue lives, 100 milliseconds is fine. For MOBAs and MMOs, we believe that ceiling's a bit higher, up at 150 milliseconds, but 100 is what we aim for. Okay, we keep everything below 100, and in all cases but one, we managed to get there. So we even got Australia down to 63 milliseconds on the East Coast at certain locations, but the average in Australia still hovers closer to around the 75 at the moment. Then you've got, your Philippines, your Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland China, all between 40 and 60. Japan comes in at about 30. South Korea comes in between 40 and 60. And that Eastern Russia block I was talking about that has really poor networking at the moment, we have got players playing from there and testing at 60 milliseconds. So that's it. That now opens up that massive gaming contingent of players. We've now found a neutral location to put some servers to service them. That's not to say you shouldn't have servers elsewhere in Asia. What we're saying now is that we're enabling, especially say you've got a 7-year-old game, you're still making money on it, but the cost of servers is now starting to creep close to that break-even point. But you've only got a sparse amount of players in Asia. Something like this could help you a lot because you can now slowly migrate your player base, your server base across to this new region, for example, or any other new regions that are coming up, and then shut down your 10 servers, then have 2 or 3 servers in a more central location for those players to keep playing on that game. You can keep supporting it. You can still keep making revenue off it. You don't have to kill the game off and upset those players. Everyone wins. So the result of this is you get to reach more players from one location, which creates a improved matchmaking experience. It improves your player liquidity, which means that your players are around for longer, because if there's more players available at a more fair latency, your matchmaking queues are going to pop faster, so people happy, like they press matchmaking, 5 seconds later they're in a game. That's perfect. It's what you want. You want people just jumping in matches, playing, jumping out, playing again. Okay, and this results in better user retention, which results in better revenue for you. It means that you make more money and you make better decisions. You've now got way more players in your game, hopefully, which means that your game's got higher popularity, and everyone's happy. Your game launch has been successful, and you might have longer longevity out of your game now. That's it. It is all location, and we believe we are right in picking this Guam thing as a solution. There are plenty of other solutions out there I've named. Like I said, if you do the stats and most of your players are in Australia and America, you've won the lottery, because those areas have good server infrastructure in them already. So yeah, that's it from me today, really. Thank you very much for your time. That's my Twitter handle there. If you've got any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm not trying to push you to use anything. I'm happy just to answer questions. If you're even curious, you're just like, hey Ben, I'm just really curious about why this submarine cable does this, or why, I don't really know, like why my game might be lagging. If you're having lag, just message me and I'll say, show me a trace route, and I'll show you how to debug. I'm happy to do that as well. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been insightful. I hope it's given you a better understanding of how little decisions you make early on, like where you put your game servers, can have massive knock-on effects down the line, or even early on in your game launch, to getting the seed to crack, to get that initial surge of players to hang around, to then grow your player base and then tell their friends and bring them in. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm Ben. Thanks for watching this GCAP presentation, and hope you have a great rest of your week or day, whatever you're up to. Thanks guys. Bye.